The usage of key signatures has a unique history that gives us an insight as to how the early Baroque composers thought of the art of composition. I'm the classical nerd, and today we're looking at key signatures. When five-line notation with clefs, and thus eventually bar lines, was just in its infancy, composers were still working within the confines of the Renaissance modes, not keys. These early composers didn't actually have a use for a key signature at all. Well, the Baroque rolls around and composers begin experimenting with what we would call today as major and minor, although this wasn't actually written down in a theory text until 1720. But simply using major and minor keys, whatever you want to call them, is not the same as it is today. They couldn't use them in the same way because not all of the keys were available to them. It was a quirk of their tuning system that allowed each individual key that they could use that wasn't horribly out of tune to have their own distinct sound. So G minor didn't sound like D minor, just down a fifth. G minor had its own unique sound that maybe in these composers' eyes wouldn't necessarily fit D minor, and vice versa. All in all, you could only go about 3 flats or 3 sharps before things started sounding funky. Baroque composers of this era thought of each key area as possessing its own distinct emotive properties, and they were all about wrenching as much emotion from the music that they wrote as they possibly could. Therefore, before the onset of the so-called common practice period in the 18th century, you have composers writing these really wild harmonic progressions that aren't really about the theoretical implications nearly as much as they're about trying to wrench as much emotion going from something that was very dark to something that was very light, or vice versa. All of which brings us to key signatures. So as standard notation was still in its infancy, composers began to use little symbols at the beginnings of their pieces to denote whether or not the piece was dark or light. The dark keys were the flat ones, and denoting a piece or a section in this dark style would be done by simply placing a single flat at the beginning, much like we would see as F major or D minor today. But in old music, you just can't take that for granted. It's not necessarily F major, and it's not necessarily D minor. You have to look at the notes themselves to see where the tonal center was. And oftentimes it does change, even if the overall theme is dark, which is what the flat would be intended to represent. The light keys were those without accidentals or with sharps, and they were notated without any key signature at all. As we move along, especially when we get into the 18th century, then standard notation really develops and coalesces around something that looks very familiar to our modern eyes. Key signatures begin to move towards actually functioning as key signatures. There's more of them, and they make sense depending on what accidentals are seen throughout the score. The final nail in the coffin for this old system of dark versus light was probably the introduction and the popularization of equal temperament tuning. Using equal temperament for the first time, every key can be used. C major and D flat major and F sharp major all sound like transposed versions of the other, which was impossible given the old types of tuning systems. On the downside, individual keys started losing their individual flavors. As music changed, so did the key signature. And actually, up to and including the classical era, occasionally you're going to see scores where a key signature is incomplete. Say you're writing in C minor, instead of seeing the usual 3 flats, you only see 2, with the other one simply written in wherever it occurs. But by and large, at this point, key signatures were at the place they're at today. Well, at least until the 20th century rolls around, because the 20th century rolls around, and of course, composers are going to be doing their own things and trying to experiment with all sorts of stuff. And so key signatures began to morph. Composers began using key signatures, or rather mode signatures, to indicate modes. Unusual modes which used both sharps and flats, or odd combinations of flats and sharps that don't fall inside the usual circle of fifths. Composers then had a compositional choice of craft. How do you make key signatures if you're not going to follow the set pattern? Actually, Hungarian composers seemed rather fond of this. In Bela Bartok's Microcosmos, Volume 4, Number 99, in a piece called Crossed Hands, one system has a key signature at V flat, while the other has F sharp and G sharp. In the first piece from Georgi Ligety's second book of Etudes, each hand sticks to a very specific whole tone scale throughout the entire piece. The right hand deals with E flat and D flat, while the left hand contends with B flat, A flat, and G flat. These are expressly there to facilitate Ligety's harmonic language. They really are there for practical purposes, and he's not trying to confuse the pianist. The 20th century abounds with odd examples such as these, but you don't see them much anymore, because even though they might be theoretically really graceful and easy to understand and easy to analyze, they're not going to be as practical when you're asking, say, a solo pianist or a pianist and a violinist to play using a key signature, or in this case mode signature, that they're just not used to, and so they kind of fell by the wayside in favor of notating each accidental individually. Key signatures... Who is calling me? What is this? Washington 1, DC.